Number 5 on this list is decapitated gladiators. Being an archaeologist must be very difficult because at one point finding the remains of a dead person could be a great historical find, and at the other point you just found the remains of a dead person. Live Science says a set of skeletons discovered in York, England belonged to tall men who died before the age of 45. What makes them gruesome is that all of them had also lost their heads. Their heads were buried with them, sometimes on their chests and sometimes between their legs or feet. Researchers aren't sure why most of the skeletons at the Driftfield Terrace were decapitated. They date to between the 2nd and 4th centuries AD, when the area was part of the Northern Roman Empire. Because most of the skeletons were particularly tall and showed signs of trauma, they may be the bones of gladiators. They might also have been military men. A genetic analysis of 7 of the decapitated skeletons found that 6 hailed from Britain, while 1 may have come from Lebanon or Syria. As if being a gladiator and having to fight to the death for people's entertainment wasn't bad enough, but these poor buggers got their heads chopped off in the process. Maybe they actually got their heads chopped off in the gladiator ring. That was something that happened every now and again. When one clear gladiator won and the other had lost, they would finish them off by chopping their heads off. What's interesting is that these remains were found in Britain. Britain in that area wasn't necessarily known for having gladiators. That doesn't mean that they didn't have their own version of them though. It's very possible that hundreds of years ago they did, and the tournaments didn't end up going in these guys' favor. Either way, a great and interesting find, but still super creepy. A discovery like this is the type that's usually accompanied by some type of ancient curse or something. Wouldn't be surprised if whoever dug these bones up is dealing with the ghost of a dead gladiator or something like that. Number 4 on this list is the Pit of Death. Anything called the Pit of Death does not sound like something I'd want to discover. Live Science says a property development project in France uncovered something truly shocking in 2012. A pit 6.5 feet deep and 5 feet in diameter, filled to the brim with bones. Even more sickening, the bones consisted of severed arms and fingers, as well as the skeletons of adults. Researchers found at least 7 upper arms, including 1 from a young teenager. On top of the amputated limbs, 7 bodies had been tossed into the pit, including that of a middle-aged man who'd had an arm chopped off and suffered a blow to the head. These bones dated back about 5,335 years. We just had a big stew of bones going on here that these archaeologists were unlucky enough to fish up. These bones would have been back in Neolithic times and were probably a byproduct of some type of warfare. The people who discovered them also theorized that this pit may have served as a justice system of some type. Like if you break the rules, then we throw you into this pit to die or something along those lines. Either way, discovering a big heap of dead bodies from thousands of years ago has got to be pretty terrifying. I don't agree with everything the legal system does now, but at least we don't need to worry about being thrown into a death pit somewhere. Number 3 on this list is the vampire burials. We have talked about vampires a lot on this channel before. Whether they're real or not is still up for debate, but these archaeologists have found some evidence to suggest that some people thought that they really were. Live Science says the real story behind Eastern European vampires is quite possibly creepier than the fictionalized tales of Dracula. Between the 16 and 1700s in Poland, some people were buried with sickles over their necks or rocks wedged under their chins. These precautions were taken to prevent the dead from rising again as vampires who locals believed would return to suck the blood of friends and family. In 2014, researchers found that the vampire burials at Drosko Cemetery in Poland were the bodies of locals who had not died of trauma. They were likely victims of an epidemic that would have felled them rapidly, the researchers told Live Science. So maybe vampires, maybe not. Either way, it's pretty scary. If they weren't vampires, then they would have just been regular people who got sick, were probably killed, and then had to get a giant rock shoved in their mouths when they're put in the ground. Creepy. But then again, if they are real vampires, then you just found some literal dead vampires, and that's not good for anyone involved. No matter how you slice this one, it's just kind of all bad. Kind of hoping that they aren't real vampires though, because if they are, who knows if they're dead for good. We don't really need some undead vampires coming back to life and sucking all of our blood. Solid no thanks for me on that one. Number 2 on this list is cannibalism. Alright, so you're probably wondering, how did they discover cannibalism? Well, Well, they discovered the evidence of cannibalism, and let me tell you, it's not pretty. Live Science says when Sir John Franklin and his crew headed off for the Arctic expedition in 1845, they hoped to navigate the Northwest Passage. They almost certainly did not expect that they'd be resorting to cannibalism within a few short years. The Franklin expedition's two ships, the HMS Terror and the HMS Erebus, became trapped in ice which failed to melt summer after summer. By April 1848, 24 men had died and the remaining crew set off in an attempt to trek to the nearest trading post. None were ever heard from again. Over time, the bones of some of the crew members were found. In 2015, researchers reported that the bones had been hacked and boiled, and many were even cracked to get at the marrow inside. The discovery speaks to the very desperate situation in which those men found themselves. You have to imagine yourself in that situation, and would you do the same? And that's it, guys. What would you do? It's the 1840s, you're freezing to death, you're starving. Do you eat your fellow comrade? It's obviously a pretty brutal question that I think nobody wants to be forced to answer. The archaeologists saw the remnants of this problem head on, and I imagine it scarred a lot of them for life. And finally, number 1 on this list is Yan Shiwei. This is a tragic story of China's only female emperor, which was discovered by some archaeologists when they uncovered her tomb. Live Science says you worked for years supporting the first female emperor to China and smoothing her rise to power. You break your own arm instead of fighting against her for a rebel army. You help her mollify civil disorder, and then your little brother goes rogue and gets you all executed. That's the sad story of Yan Shiwei, one of the favorite officials of Wu Zetian, the founder of China's Zhou dynasty. Archaeologists uncovered Yan Shiwei's 1300-year-old tomb and discovered the tale on a stone-inscribed epitaph. Yan Shiwei's little brother, Yan Shiwei, turned against Wu Zetian around 699. As a collective punishment, the entire family was executed and, according to the carvings, carelessly buried. Wow, we got an entire Game of Thrones season out of this terrifying discovery. Apparently, the execution really wasn't all that nice either, folks. This discovery is truly a window into what life would have been like back in that time. It really was the Wild West back then, and pretty much anything went. Pretty scary to picture how all of this went down, though. Who knows, maybe HBO will see this story's potential and put it on the screen for all of us.
Kicking off at number 5, the Phaleron Delta Necropolis. Now, Greece, of course, is the land of one of this planet's longest standing ancient civilizations, and dig sites are a dime a dozen across both the rural and metropolitan areas of the country, slowly uncovering the mysteries of a long-lost Greek society. While in early 2016, researchers discovered one terrifyingly unique manner of burial and mass execution. Apparently because, well, they're not entirely sure. Found in a large ancient cemetery in part of the Phaleron Delta Necropolis in Athens were at least 80 skeletons in a line stacked on top of each other with their wrists clamped together in a chain of iron shackles. The strangest thing was, though, that all of these men were incredibly young and in a very good state of health, indicating that they weren't slaves or common criminals, and the orderly, uniform way that they were buried seemed to support this. Whatever happened was an incredibly violent act, with their hands bound above their heads before being uniformly executed. The whole thing doesn't really make any sense at all, but the leading theory is that all of these young men were part of an attempted coup during a period of great unrest for Athenian society. The coup failed, of course, but the fact that these men were all buried in a respectful manner despite the violent circumstances that they were executed in leaves far more perplexing questions than it does answers. Swinging in at number 4, the Persian siege. Now, in the ancient world, sieges and bloody battles were the only real way to get things done, but during an age where the most cutting-edge technology was a composite ballista, it was pretty shocking when archaeologists discovered some startling evidence of chemical warfare. In 256 AD, well, turns out that over 2,000 years ago, 19 Roman soldiers rushed into a cramped underground tunnel as they prepared to defend the Roman-held Syrian city of Dura-Europos from an army of Persian soldiers digging beneath the city's mud brick walls. Instead of meeting a horde of Persian besiegers, though, they were met by one soldier, and then a wall of noxious black smoke turned their lungs into acid. They all died in excruciating pain, sealed for eternity beneath the earth. But flash forward to the 1920s, though, and French archaeologist Robert Dumensil began excavating the Roman site that backed up against the Euphrates River. That's when he found the piled up skeletal remains of the 19 Roman soldiers and one lone Persian at the other end of the tunnel. Initially, he thought that the Persian soldier had somehow managed to defeat 19 highly trained legionnaires in close quarters combat, but that's when he noticed crystals of sulfur and bitumen scattered across the tunnel wall. walls. Turned out the Persian force had developed an experimental tar-like petrochemical that burnt fast and hot and killed with deadly efficiency. Also turns out that chemical warfare was much more common than we expected in the ancient world. What a way to go, eh? Next up at number 3, the mystery of Herxheim. And this one is pretty damn terrifying, really. Sometime in 5300 BC, which is a long time ago, what is known as a linear pottery culture developed in the southwest region of Herxheim in Germany, one that for all intents and purposes could be described as an idyllic, peaceful Stone Age settlement. Safe from invaders and predators, the village thrived with its rudimentary agriculture and societal development. That is until sometime around 4950 BC, when the settlement in Herxheim abruptly and without warning disappeared. But they didn't exactly disappear, instead they were ritualistically butchered, smashed to pieces and buried beneath the same dirt that they once called home. Turns out in 2009 an archaeological dig site unearthed human remains of over 1,000 ancient villagers. The bones were of men, women. Stranger still though, tool markings on all of the bones showed that the flesh had been carefully scraped off, while larger bones had been broken, possibly to get at the marrow inside. Hell, even the skulls were cracked open in an effort to extract their brains. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing and were incredibly proficient at butchering the human anatomy, presumably to eat, as there was no sign of the removed flesh in the surrounding area. It gets weirder though, because after extracting DNA from their remains, it turned out that these people came from all over Europe in roughly a 500-mile radius. In fact, the leading theory is that all of these people volunteered to come to Herxheim on their own free will to be ritualistically sacrificed and then seemingly eaten. Yeah. Coming in at number 2, the Tomb of the Sunken Skulls. Talking of ritualistic burial sites, there's an even older one, and it's even weirder actually. Sometime in 2009, archaeologists found what they believe to be a Stone Age settlement near what was once a shallow lake in Motala, a town in southwest Sweden. The routine dig took a strange turn though when researchers discovered the skulls and skull fragments from 11 individuals, including men, women, children and infants. In fact, the site, which would later be known as Canal Jordan, turned out to be nearly 8,000 years old. But we also have to remember that Canal Jordan was a lake and the remains were found stacked inside a large stone mass grave with a giant heavy lid built on the bottom of a body of water. Hey, it gets weirder though guys, because 2 of the human skulls found were pierced with wooden stakes, with the majority of the others showing signs of also being penetrated by sharp objects. It seemed to point toward using their heads as some sort of bizarre trophy or totem, but also it poses the question, why would you then bury them underneath a lake in a stone tomb with children? But hey, again it gets even weirder, because one of the female skulls found there was actually filled with fragments of bone from all of the other skulls in the tomb, like some weird kind of horrifying potpourri. The leading theory is that Canal Jordan likely served as a sacred meeting spot for several nomadic bands of Mesolithic Swedes roaming the forest and shores of Sweden over 8,000 years ago. For some reason though, they felt compelled to bury people's heads in a stone tomb at the bottom of a lake, and no one really knows why. My best guess though, vampires. Or aliens. Alien vampires. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, the Clad Halan mummies. If you know anything about bog bodies, you'll know that they're already terrifying enough. The British Isles are relatively unique in the sense that they're littered with geographical peat bogs, a unique high acid, low oxygen environment which inhibits specific bacteria that break down organics. Because of that, they're also perfect for preserving bodies, and history has shown numerous instances of discovering ancient bodies hidden away in the deep peat bogs of Scotland, Ireland, England and Wales. Well, usually they're just incredibly well preserved, mummified perfectly for archaeological purposes, but back in early 2012 scientists discovered 2 3,000-year-old Scottish bog bodies, remnants of the 11th century ancestral houses of Clad Halan, a prehistoric village on the Isle of South Uist. But hold on, because if that timeline isn't already peculiar enough, it gets weirder. Because first and foremost, researchers discovered that these 2 corpses had been buried between 300 and 600 years after their death. Hold on though, because it does get weirder, because these corpses quickly had scientists scratching their heads because their bones just didn't match up, although they showed clear signs of being articulated as one whole cadaver. Turned out after DNA testing each of their limbs, they were from completely separate people, all of which had died at different points in ancient history. It's what's called a composite mummy, and no one has any idea what the hell it was or still is, but for some reason an ancient society was collecting body parts and sticking them all together in some horrifying Frankensteinian manner. Yeah, let that one sink in, just like a peat bog body. Kicking off at number 5, the Massacre of Nataruk. And whilst this may not be the most surprising entry on the surface, after all, battlefields and sites of mass brutal warfare are often the first place that archaeologists look when trying to dig up the many ghosts of the past. No, because it's in the sense and scale of the Battle of Nataruk that makes this one incredibly interesting from a modern perspective. In 2012, just off the southwest edges of Lake Turkana in Kenya, a mass pile of bones were uncovered at a site known as Nataruk. To begin with, researchers first discovered several bones in a site that had once been a lagoon that were in the process of gradually being revealed by the sands of time. But as they dug deeper, the crew found a total of 27 skeletons, some that were nearly complete and some that were merely a few fragments of bone, but all of them had one thing in common. They dated back between 9,000 and 10,500 years ago. But it was in the haphazard arrangement of these skeletons that really made the researchers take note, because Nataruk was by no means a burial site, but instead evidence of a brutal massacre. A massacre that occurred with at least 30 people in a time where anthropology believes that humanity only roamed in small groups of hunter-gatherers. Pretty much all of the bodies harboured blunt force trauma head wounds, as well as evidence of arrow wounds to the head and neck. They were men, women and children, and one of them was found with her knees broken, lying on her side with her wrists in front as if they were bound. Although the Massacre of Nataruk still only offers more questions than answers, one thing is for certain: war has been a bloody page in our history books for a lot longer than we first thought. Swinging in at number 4, Aragundi's Mummified Lung. Which, if you can't tell already with part 1 and part 2, pretty much all of these entries would make up a noteworthy death metal album in their own right, and Aragundi's Mummified Lung is no exception. Mainly because I just love saying Aragundi's Mummified Lung. Anyway, if you know anything about ancient European history, you will know that the Merovingian dynasty of legend that ruled throughout Central Europe up until the 8th century, predominantly as kings and queens of France and Germany, were pretty interesting folk to say the least. The vast majority of their remains are buried in intricate stone sarcophagi in the Basilica of Saint Denis in Paris, but in 1959, when an archaeologist was digging through the site, he discovered a pretty strange skeleton that wasn't like the rest. Because this one, as you may have guessed, had a single mummified lung, alongside the rest of her skeleton, a single strand of hair, bits of jewellery, and several fragments of textiles and leather. This was Arnegundis Regine, a Merovingian queen that lived between 515 and 580 as one of the 6 wives of King Clotaire I. But why did she have a single mummified lung? No one else did, and it wasn't exactly common practice throughout ancient European culture, right? Well, as it turns out, yes, it was, although the Merovingians were just really bad at it. In a few isolated cases, their people would attempt to embalm particularly elite individuals following the mummification procedure that they'd learned from the Romans, which in turn the Romans had adopted from the Egyptians. It's like telephone but with mummification. Their idea was to inject a strange tincture into the throat of the corpse and kind of just hope that it mummified the rest of the body. In this case, nope, it was just a single lung. Nice try though. Next up at number 3, Pit of the Bones. And we've had many pits as so far in our top 5 scary archaeological list, most notably the Pit of Arms that you guys aptly decided to call the Armpit, but this one is a little bit more terrifying than the rest. And what if I told you it contained evidence of death and burial that was at least 500,000 years old? Yeah. Hold on a minute. In Spain, in the Atapuerca mountain range, lie a series of caves that wind deep within the rock, and at the end of one of those winding corridors is a pit that plunges 43 feet into the deep darkness. At the bottom of that pit are thousands upon thousands of tiny bone fragments that researchers have found to make up at least 28 individuals of the species Homo heidelbergensis, as well as a completely other unknown species of humanoid, perhaps believed to be of Denisovan origin. Now, don't get me wrong, this particular entry is more intriguing than anything else, but a pit of complete and utter darkness that has over 30 skeletal corpses at the bottom of it, yeah, whilst being something straight out of a horror movie, it's also, you know, sounds like something that would have been planned, right, by say a community of people. But wait, their bodies are over 400,000 years old. Why would anyone be throwing 30 plus bodies down a pit over 400,000 years ago? I mean, being terrifying aside, the Pit of the Bones is awesome, and we're yet to learn so much more from it. Hopefully, anyway. Swinging in at number 2, Cannibal Neanderthals. Again, another band name. Am I right? But if we're talking about caves, we also need to talk about one of the most horrifyingly stark reminders of the desperate dangers that the denizens of our fair planet Earth can be forced to take. It is thought that between 120 and 130,000 years ago, our Neanderthal cousins died out after not being able to adapt to the incredible climate change transitioning across our planet. It is thought to have taken several generations, but in that brief period of time, it seems that Neanderthals were forced to go to incredibly extreme lengths to survive. There are over 220 European sites alone that show similar evidence, but one in particular has perhaps the bleakest encounter. In the cave of Bois-Moulagursi in southeastern France, archaeologists discovered 120 bones from over 6 individuals that would otherwise have gone unnoticed as they were mixed together with a grouping of animal bones. The Neanderthal remains showed a brutal resemblance though, as each of the bones were shown to have desperate cut marks across their entire skeleton, literally from head to toe. Not only that, but they also shown clear signs of crushing and chewing in a manner that was consistent with a single episode of cannibalism. Neanderthals usually buried their dead, but not in this case. Researchers believe that this was the final desperate act of a dying species forced to resort to eating their own people in an attempt to survive. It by no means makes them monsters, but instead people who had no other option if they wanted to keep on living, a species that had failed to adapt to a changing planet. There's a warning somewhere in that one, right? And finally, coming in at a number 1 spot, the Heslington Brain, which makes up 5 for 5 in our death metal album listing because come on, this stuff is just writing itself at the minute. How old do you reckon the oldest preserved human brain is? A couple of hundred years? 500 years? Well, no. The oldest preserved human brain is in fact 3,000 years old. In 2008, buried in a pit near the village of Heslington in Yorkshire, England, an archaeological dig commissioned by the University of York discovered a dismembered human skull buried beneath the earth. Which, you know, any kind of head without a body is already terrifying enough, but of course, in this case, it gets worse. Around the skull were a series of possibly ritualistic objects, but of course there was no body, which instantly begged the question, who the hell was burying heads with ritualistic objects over 3,000 years ago? Well, of course, it gets even more worse because as researchers were making laboratory observations on the skull, they noticed that there was something inside of it, and that was the Heslington brain, the oldest organic ancient brain tissue in recorded knowledge, which had been perfectly preserved in the strange manner that it had been buried. You see, according to researchers, it's thought that the subterranean surroundings of the head did wonders for its preservation, given the fact that it had been separated from the poor victim's body and buried nearly immediately after death. However, as of 2019, the precise mechanism by which the Heslington brain was preserved is a complete and utter mystery. All we have is a 3,000-year-old brain that we have no idea what to do with. If you're asking me, although I usually like to keep a factual head on this shoulders, I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say that this one is probably the likeliest case for vampires. Definitely.
Number 5. Spiral graves. Okay, remember in Game of Thrones when all those body parts were left in like a crazy weird spiral formation? The Night King or the whatever king was doing it? I don't know. Imagine if you were walking and all of a sudden you see that. I would probably throw up on the spot. Well, that's pretty close to what was found beneath Mexico City in 2006. Archaeologists discovered a 2,400-year-old burial site containing 10 bodies, placed in a very peculiar way. The bodies were found roughly 4 feet beneath a building at the Pontifical University of Mexico. And here's the weird part. The bodies were found in a spiral formation around a centric point, as if they were kind of moving around something. Which is even weirder, the arm bones were interlocked, so it's like, were they placed there on purpose? What's going on here? To quote Jimena Rivera, director of the Project of Excavation and Archaeological Salvage, nailed that one I think, there was one individual over the other. So for example, the head of one individual was like in the chest of another, and the hand of one dude was like under the back of another guy. What a weird party. And the craziest part, the body of a baby was found on top of another body. This whole thing is just disgusting. What kind of ritual was this? There's been no previous record of a burial done that way, so why now? It's still unclear why this burial site even exists, or why the bodies were placed in such odd ways. Who knows, maybe it was a surprise birthday party and the guy didn't show up, so they just stayed there for 2,000 years. That, my friend, is commitment. Number 4, the London Hammer. Found in 1936 in London, Texas. not London, England, or London, Ontario. We don't talk about that third one. A man named Max Hahn and his wife spotted a strange rock that seemed to have a wooden handle sticking out of it. Now, of course, they were curious, so they went over and took a closer look. They realized that the wooden handle was moving a bit, but the rock was wrapped around it. Odd. So once the rock was then cracked open, it was revealed that there was a hammer inside of the rock. Thor, is this yours? The rock itself dates to be back from the Ordovician period, which was about 400 million years ago, give or take. Which is pretty wild considering that human beings have only really been around for about 200,000 years. So what's the deal? Is this hammer from the future, Asgard? We need answers now. The hammer itself is in amazing condition for being as old as it is. Strangely enough, parts of the handle have actually turned into coal, yet the 96% iron hammerhead has yet to rust. I've gone through like 3 bikes in my adult life. The rust got 2 of them real good, real good. This hammer must have been covered in CLR. Or a mystery is afoot, I don't know. The hammer is 6 inches long and 1 inch thick, and it doesn't look like it was made by accident. The hammer is actually very similar to late 1800 man-made tools, so the discovery has us stumped. How can something be made that long ago by humans? Many believe this is the first piece of evidence that time travel exists. Also, how is it still intact? I feel like the wood should have broke off ages ago. If you want a glimpse of the mystery hammer yourself, you can find it on display right now in the Creation Evidence Museum in Glen Rose, Texas. And then you can decide for yourself. Number 3, Antikythera mechanism. After being submerged for over 2,000 years, we believe we found the oldest known analog computer to date. Discovered in 1902 by Greek politician Spyridon Stais, this clock-sized device was said to be made sometime between 70 and 200 BCE. That's an old clock. More like a great-grandfather clock, am I right? So does this thing track your steps? Can it change songs? No and no. It was actually meant for much more. This extremely complex piece of history was meant to calculate the positions of astronomical objects. Containing over 30 spinning gears and wheels, and colored rocks even, to mark which planet was which, the Antikythera mechanism also tracked the moon, the sun, all the eclipses, and most importantly, what day the Olympics are. Talk about a cool reminder. I think it was yesterday. Sorry, I know, it was, I messed up, I f***ed up, sorry guys. We're not quite sure how humans figured this out that long ago, but each additional piece we discover gets us closer to our very old truth. The closest discovery we have to this device are medieval cathedral clocks, but those were built about a millennium later, so where did this come from? Aliens? Autobots? You be the judge. Number 2, the Black Knight satellite. First discovered in 1954 by Dr. Lincoln La Paz, the Black Knight satellite is the oldest recorded satellite in history. When news broke that La Paz had discovered the satellite, it was a pretty eye-opening headline, considering that there were no countries that have actually launched a satellite at that time yet. And it was photographs of the Black Knight that were released in 1998 that caught our attention. This photo. Now, before jumping to the conclusion that this is an alien space knight, the Pentagon initially thought that the Russians had just beaten them into space. Now, space journalist James Oberg says it's just a lost piece of heating equipment from when they were building the International Space Station. Oh yeah, you sure about that, James? Huh? What, do you work for NASA or something? He does? Huh. While that theory does make a lot of sense, there are still other factors that play into this conspiracy. Nikola Tesla previously discovered some strange signals that many believe was actually the same Black Knight satellite. While at his laboratory in Colorado Springs in 1899, he picked up radio signals that he believed came from, well, another planet. Who knows, maybe the Black Knight will just collide with Elon Musk's space car and then he'll just fire up the engine and head down to Earth. I feel like that's the only thing left for 2020 at this point. And lastly, number 1. Gobekli Tepe. When you think of old man-made landmarks, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? The pyramids maybe? Stonehenge perhaps? Discovered in 1994 in Sanliurfa, Turkey, Safak Yildiz came across a stone that had an unusual shape to it that was sticking out of the ground and decided to get a closer look. Who knows, maybe it's another one of those time-traveling hammers. Once realizing it was attached to a much larger rock, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt came in and dug up the grounds. What he found was much cooler than an oddly shaped rock. See, this rock was actually a T-shaped pillar and was one of a dozen found. And each pillar was around 20 tons, covered with carvings of animals like birds and insects. And the best part? The rock dates to be about 60,000 years older than Stonehenge. Excuse me? Around each of the massive pillars were large circles of stones, and each of these stone monuments would have taken years to be moved, first of all, and the carvings on top of that? This is just wild. So what is this? Why is this here? Well, Klaus Schmidt believed that it was for ancient funerals, and had hoped that during the exploration he would find bodies under rock circles or under the pillars. That's a wild thing to hope for. I've never been here at work and been like, I really hope I find some bodies hidden under some rocks. Fingers crossed. They didn't find anything though, and we have yet to find any signs of previous life on the site to this day, or plant life for that matter. Some researchers have even gone so far to say that it's the biblical Garden of Eden. So what do you think Gobekli Tepe is hiding? Let us know in the comments down below.